All right. So again, my name is Robert. I am the program coordinator here at the LaSalle Public Library. I'm very excited to talk to you guys about the Oregon Trail today. Before we get started, for anyone who hasn't actually been on the Oregon Trail themselves, how much do we know about the Oregon Trail?
I know what's from Nebraska and Wyoming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know what the video
It is also a video game. So the Oregon Trail was a 2,170-mile wagon route that led from Missouri all the way to Oregon. Hundreds of thousands of settlers traveled along this trail in the mid-1800s, and this route would take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the route taken, the speed in which you traveled, lots of variables depended on how fast you traveled this trail. For reference, the distance from here to Chicago, the city, is 85 miles, which is 4% of the way, and they didn't have highways or cars. So it was a long trek. Lewis and Clark were the first
Can
ones.
you shut the lights down a little bit?
Yeah,
Maybe?
if that makes it easier.
Yeah.
So Lewis and Clark were the first ones to
Not much better.
kind of explore this section of the country after being tasked by President Thomas Jefferson to scout the Missouri River to find a route to better communicate with the other side of the country. They weren't really able to find a practical route, especially for wagons, since crossing the Rocky Mountains is difficult on foot, let alone with wagons. However, they did set the standard. They paved the way for the mountain men who would come later and find a better, more reasonable path across the country through the mountains to Oregon. However, it was always still a challenge. Eventually, Robert Stewart and his companions, due to fear of attack from Crow warriors, traveled south of the path that Lewis and Clark established and found a much easier and practical route across the country. After finding a path past the Rocky Mountains and across the Continental Divide, I believe that was called the South Pass. So if we look at the map, I'm going to block the light, but this dotted line up here is the path that Lewis and Clark established. So they were way up north. Eventually, Robert Stewart, they found this red line, which was a little more south. You can't read any of those words, but they encountered much less mountain terrain and were therefore able to create a path that someone could take a wagon and supplies through without having to be a mountain man like Robert Stewart and his companions were. So a big misconception based off the video game is that these families traveled independently in their own wagon by themselves. Most of the time, they traveled in these wagon trains, which were wagon upon wagon upon wagon. Families would travel together, rely on each other to survive, safety in numbers, that type of idea. Down here, this is what they would do at the end of traveling for the day to kind of set up a camp by circling the wagons around, gave them protection from any attacks, kind of kept everyone together. There were a ton of benefits of traveling together, as in any type of pack travel. They could rely on each other. They could trade each other. So if someone's wagon broke but someone else had supplies, they could trade in order to fix the wagon, keep going. They would go hunting together. They would rely on each other. However, like any type of group environments, there were also some issues with it. This was a long trek, and if you spend 6 months on a road trip with anyone, tensions will at some point boil over. So there were occasional fights, occasional murders. Again, along the Oregon Trail, this wasn't technically part of the country at this time. So a lot of the established laws were not in place. So as we'll talk about a little bit later, there are some people who got away with crimes that otherwise they shouldn't have. And it was based more off of they dealt out justice however they seemed fit. So we'll talk a little bit more with some specific examples later. So we're going to talk a lot more about how dangerous this track was, but without doing so, we got to think about why they would make this choice in the first place. The Oregon Trail was a nightmare. It wasn't the fun road trip that the video game makes it seem. It's estimated that at least 10% of those who started their journeys did not make it to Oregon, with the current estimate amounting to 20,000 to 30,000 deaths over the 3 decades that the trail was active. Statistic was like, for every football field of distance, you had at least 2 deaths the entire length of the Oregon Trail. So it was a lot of bodies along the trail. So why were people so eager to make this risk to travel to Oregon? It's because Oregon and California promised the perfect paradise, essentially. Oregon was perfect. There was a ton of essentially free land for these farmers and poorer middle class people to create a new, more prosperous life. We were at the very early stages of the gold rush, especially in California. So for a lot of these people, this was their ticket to a better life. This was worth all the risk that they would take to travel. I mean, look at that. Oregon's beautiful. So every wagon trip started in Independence, Missouri. Independence was the starting point for not just the Oregon Trail, but also the Mormon and California trails. And because of that, it became a very popular, high functioning trading post, essentially. And this was very important because back in the time of the Oregon Trail, if you left Independence, Missouri, if you began on the trail, there wasn't a gas station 20 miles down the way. There was a Walmart for you to restock on. If you didn't have something that you needed when you left Independence, you were going to have a hard time getting it. So that's great because Independence really did have almost anything you needed. So we're going to go through this list about some of the very important things that they needed along the trail, starting with the oxen. So 50 to 75% of pioneer wagons were pulled by oxen. Others were pulled by mules or horses, but oxen were the most popular for a large amount of reasons. Obviously, they're big, strong beasts. They can easily travel difficult terrain. They can pull a very, very heavy wagon, and they're reliable. They're also much less likely to be stolen by Native Americans than horses were. That was a big issue for people who chose horses to travel the trail, is that they were stolen a lot. The fun thing that happened between the settlers and their oxen were the relationship between the oxen and the settlers functioned almost like that of a family pet, but also of that of a dude in his muscle car almost. Because to these families, they were both. The oxen were their vehicle and their family pet. So you have journal entries about a hailstorm where the men of the wagon camp have to head out with these thick blankets to shield the oxen, and therefore put their bodies in the path of the hail, protect their oxen, because they really did love their oxen. Because who doesn't love animals? If you spend 4 months with this big cow, essentially, you're gonna have a nice time with it, which made it really sad if they didn't make it all the way down the trail. A big issue with the oxen and also the mules and horses is that if you push them too quickly, you wear down their hooves, they become a lot less helpful when they can't walk without pain. We'll talk more about this later, but the Oregon Trail was essentially a race against time. You needed to make it to Oregon before the winter cold came, otherwise it would be a very bad time. We'll talk more about how bad people can have it in the winter. But if you push your oxen, you race 30 miles out, and then their hoof breaks, you're not going to be moving much further than you would if you were just taking your time. It's a real tortoise and the hare situation. You needed to take your time, but not lollygag. Food. What's a road trip without snacks? Food is, of course, super important to pack when you're going to be spending 3 to 6 months in the wilderness. They had to play this balancing game between having enough food, but also not overloading the wagon. Because again, you have a human living creature is working to pull the wagon. So if you put 2,000 pounds of food on the wagon, you're not going to be making a lot of progress. So you have to find that healthy in between enough food, but still able to make a good pace. This led to their food selection being very slim, mainly basic monotonous foods, beans, cornmeal, occasionally in the early stages, heavily smoked and salted bacon. They would enjoy that, a little bit of flavor before that went bad. They drank coffee with almost every meal because it was a flavor that they could take with them better than just water. It led to them boiling the water before drinking it. It was there to kind of give some flavor to the food, especially with hardtack. On days where they couldn't make a fire or they couldn't cook anything, they relied on hardtack, which is a really hard, very dry cracker. And so if you had that with coffee, you could soften it a little bit, give it a little bit of flavor, make it better than just eating dirt, essentially. Dinners were also influenced by how successful hunting and foraging went, with most of their foods coming from the trail itself. They use the land to provide a little bit of that flavor. They can't take a ton of meat with them from independence because that will go bad very quickly. So any meat they had was from the trail itself. The last thing you want to do was run out of food. So clothing. People see the Oregon Trail and give it a kind of cowboy style. It wasn't quite that. Everything they wore there was a reason for everything they wore. So men, as we can see in the picture, wore long sleeve shirts, pants, commonly jeans, along with a wide brimmed hat, occasionally a vest, along with thick leather boots. This outfit was, of course, to protect from the sun mainly. Again, you're outside for 3 to 6 months consecutively. The sun is very, very hot because it's the middle of summer. They didn't have sunscreen, so they wanted to wear those clothes to protect them from the rays of the sun. The jeans and the boots also protected from any plants, snakes especially, plants they might brush against, just any natural threats. This outfit was also the best. We won't discuss how terrible the foot injuries were from walking miles in boots in the hot summer, but you had some gnarly foot infections along the trail, but the boots made it worth it. Similar style for the women. They were dressed with a high neckline and a lifted hem for ease of movement, so they weren't tripping on the dress on their way. They wore wide-brimmed bonnets, again, to protect from the sun, and comfortable leather shoes for walking. They also a lot of times wore aprons. That way they could preserve the clothes they wore when they were cooking or traveling or doing anything that might get a little bit messy. Ammunition. Pioneers needed to make sure that they had plenty of ammunition and weapons to protect them from anything they might encounter along the trail. Some popular weapons included double and single-barreled shotguns, pistols, and rifles, with the most popular being a reliable Kentucky rifle. The issue with this, though, is that most of the people traveling down the trail did not have firearm experience. The most they might have handled a gun would be if they were a farmer and they needed to use it to fend off a coyote or something from their crops. These were not people who were familiar with firearms, and because of that, there were a handful of terrible accidents involving them. Additionally, these were guns made in the 1800s. They were not as advanced as the weapons we have today. So a lot of the times, even if they did everything perfectly, guns would malfunction, explode, cause terrible harm in a way they weren't supposed to. And then finally, we have our wagons. You can barely read any of that, but this was a popular type of wagon to use down the trail. We have all the pieces So the hocks are attached to the neck yoke. You'll notice there's no front driver's seat. That's because no one actually drove the wagons. They were more like trailers than they were vehicles. Most of the times the people would travel alongside it, and that way they would also lighten the load of the ox. So you take 5 people off a wagon, that's at least 1,000 pounds or something. You'll also notice the tires are 2 different sizes. This made it both easier to turn and conquer difficult terrain. The smaller wheels in the front made turning more reasonable, while the wheels in the back made it easier to get over rocks and ledges and the like. There's a brake lever right there if they can't slow down the ox themselves. And then the other interesting thing is the combination of the bonnet and the sideboards. So the sideboards are beveled out at an angle to prevent any rain or any type of precipitation from getting inside the wagon while it's moving. Because when everything you own, all of your supplies are inside this box, last thing you want to do is have it get wet, especially when your clothes are in there. So, are there any questions before we head off down the trail? If not, we're going to get going. So, we're rolling along. Spent a lot of time making those wheels roll. I hope you appreciate them. But the first issue a lot of people encountered on the trail were the rivers. There's a lot of rivers that cross across the country. They encountered a lot of them, and they didn't have the luxury of a bridge or going around them. So when they had to cross a river, they mainly had 3 options. The 3 main options was to ferry the wagon across. If there was a ferry available, you could usually pay a small fee. And as we see in this picture right here, you and your wagon and everything you have would be ferried across for a small fee. This was usually the safest option, but the issues were they weren't available on every river, and it cost money. Another option would be to build a raft and basically make your own ferry. Bring your wagon across on your own raft. The issues with this were it took a lot of time and labor to build a raft that could suit your wagon and everything you had. And then finally, if you were crazy, you could ford the wagon across the river. And what this essentially meant is you take a gamble and you just try to cross across it. This could go wrong so quickly, and it did for a lot of people because especially in early spring when all the snow's melting, rivers are a lot higher than they seem. And so if your wagon submerges or your oxes panic or your wagon tips, there's a lot of stuff to happen. Also keep in mind, a lot of these people traveling could not just go to the YMCA for swim lessons, and they didn't know how to swim. So there were also a lot of drownings that came across trying to get across a river. You could also, with your options available, you could relatively waterproof your wagon better than they already are by making pitch and caulking your wagon. You can seal it a little bit tighter, make fording a little bit more safe. But we cross the river, we're going to continue down the trail. We see a little barn coming up. Wonder what that could be. We've arrived to Fort Kearney. So on the actual map, there were about 2 or 3 rivers that they would have to cross very early on in the trail before they even reached the first kind of checkpoint almost, which was Fort Kearney. Fort Kearney, as we can see here, was a small little fort settlement that was built to protect those bound for Oregon. It was about 16% of the way through the trail and offered a quick resupply rest stop. People could trade with others here at the fort. They could rest in an actual house with a roof, which is always nice, and resupply from anything they might have lost crossing the multiple rivers it took. There were a handful of other forts that were encountered along the trail, including Fort Laramie, Fort Bridger, Fort Hall, Fort Boise, and Fort Walla Walla. These all served as rest points and trading points for wagon families, with some being a little bit more restful, some being a little bit more supplied for trading. Many of which were constructed for the very purpose of protecting those mountains of Oregon. But once the Oregon Trail began to slow down, they were all repurposed into actual military forts for the upcoming Civil War, which you may have heard of. I love the wagon wheels. So we've left Fort Laramie. We're continuing down the trail. What's this coming up? It's Chimney Rock. So this is what Chimney Rock looks like in the video game, and this is the real life Chimney Rock today. So this huge rock was one of the main trademark landmarks of the Oregon Trail. Remember, people traveling down the trail are usually going off of either spoken direction or a map, and therefore landmarks like Chimney Rock are vital for making sure that they are still on the right path. They can make sure they're still making good time. It's a landmark, check mark, just like
You can visit Chimney Rock, but
yeah.
you can't go out there.
Mhm.
It's private property, I believe, or something like that.
Because today it's still nearly 300 feet tall, even though evidence from back then did show it being taller. It has since been eroding. It crumbles a little bit. It was damaged by gunfire in the Civil War and other wars since, mainly the Civil War. You can see it's a little bit taller in that photo. This isn't from the Oregon Trail, of course, but a little bit after cameras were made. Other notable landmarks they encountered: Scotts Bluff, Independence Rock, Devil's Gate, a handful of more. These were all landmarks, making sure that they were still making good time, going the correct way. Yeah.
Why is it called the Independence Rock?
That's a good name because it is not related to Independence, Missouri. I'm not sure why it's named Independence Rock, but it's not. It's separate from Independence Town. That's a good question. But this also broke up the monotony of the terrain they had come to know. Because there's not a lot of exciting stuff on the 2,000 miles. So seeing stuff like this really was exciting. They were hundreds of feet tall, served as waypoints. A really fun thing about these landmarks is it shows how little people have changed over time. If you go to them today, you can still see the tags that settlers made. So on the right, you can see Mary Morris was there September 12, 1852. Something we still do. We love we love carving stuff into rocks, making people see that we were there, leaving our little mark. So even way back when, almost 200 years ago, they were still tagging rocks and leaving their marks on their surroundings.
One time I went to Starved Rock, and there's a place with a lot of caves and waterfalls, and in the caves there are like billions of natives.
Yeah, they're all over the place because it's just something fun to do. The rocks will last a lot longer than they will or we will. You need to leave your little mark. So we're going to leave Chimney Rock. We'll continue along the way. It doesn't look like there's anything coming up, but we might be getting hungry. Let's go hunting. So, in the video game, made hunting look a lot more fun and easy than it actually was. Hunting was not usually a single person activity. The men would usually go out together, especially when dealing with larger game like bison or occasionally bears. This is because hunting bison and bears is dangerous. And again, these people who were going hunting were not hunters. They were farmers with guns. Other concerns with hunting included being separated and lost from the rest of the wagon train. And overhunting was also the issue. Because early on in the Oregon Trail, there was plenty of game available. This was all relatively unexplored land. And then as people continued to take this trail for years, It became harder to find game close to the trail, so people ended up having to go further and further away. And then you're hunting a bear, you get a low turnaround, you can't find your way back. There's not a lot that you can do, so you don't want to get lost. The other issue was with overhunting. The Oregon Trail had a big hand to play in the near extinction of the American bison. And it's very upsetting when you think about all the food that was wasted along the way. You take 3 men and kill 2 bison. 3 men can maybe take most of 1, and then you have an entire bison to just rot outside. A lot of wasted potential meat. So we're gonna keep on going. Great with time. Oh, that's not good. So this is the bird everyone's been looking forward to, I'm sure. Let's talk about the diseases on the Oregon Trail. There were a lot, and they were all very gross. So diseases were rampant along the Oregon Trail, partially because of how dirty everything was, partially because of how close-knit everyone was, because again, you've got these big communities of people traveling together for a very extended amount of time. Some of the big ones were measles, which is one that still exists today. It's caused by coming in contact with the virus rubeola, and it's an infection of the respiratory tract. Symptoms included high fever, cough, runny nose, and a full body rash. That's one of the best ones. Diphtheria is a bacterial infection covered by the same vaccine as tetanus, because they are related in terms of infection. It is spread through contaminated droplets or infected wounds, and the main symptom is the bacteria is a toxin that especially goes to work in the nasal cavity. So it ends up killing cells that form a almost thick gray cell membrane in the throat and nasal cavity, making it very difficult to breathe. This became fatal very quickly if that membrane just made it impossible to breathe, or the toxin got to the heart. It could lead to heart failure, or it also affected the nerves in the throat and could potentially make swallowing just impossible. And then you got to like drown in your own saliva, which is a fun way to go. And then we've got smallpox. Smallpox is one that's been eradicated since the time, but it's very common. So it's very contagious, especially within close-knit wagon communities. The illness resulted in a bumpy rash full of contaminated droplets. It was also spread through beddings and clothing. So when you have a limited amount of clothes and blankets, you'll end up having to burn them essentially because you can't really wash them that well. So then you have even less clothing and bedding than you did before. And smallpox was fatal about 30% of the time.
Did you hear there's a new virus going around called monkeypox?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they never stop. So typhoid fever is caused by a strain of the Salmonella bacteria. All 3 of these, typhoid, cholera, and dysentery, are picked up through contaminated food and water. Typhoid fever, if left untreated, essentially goes to town on your organs, and the toxin kind of just rips them apart. It's really unpleasant. It can pop your gallbladder. Not something you want to have. Cholera and dysentery, those are the 2 big ones, with cholera being the main fatal disease that people encountered along the trail, followed behind by dysentery. They're both very similar. Both are caught by ingesting dirty food and water. The main difference is what type of diarrhea you have. Cholera is intense but very watery, which would lead to a very quick and severe dehydration. You could die within hours of contracting cholera due to intense dehydration very suddenly. Similarly, dysentery was also a very intense diarrhea, but instead of being watery, it was very bloody, but could also prove fatal due to severe and quick dehydration. All of them, unpleasant ways to go, all of them still existing somewhere in the world, but much rarer and not as much in America because we filter our water. Any questions about any of these pleasant diseases? All right, then we will keep on going along. I think the worst is behind us. I mean, how can you get worse than dysentery? Uh-oh. Malerk is on fire. So, there was so much that could go wrong while traveling down the Oregon Trail. Wagons were prone to breaking and getting stuck, as we can see in the bottom left. When everything that you own is in this wagon, you really don't want to leave it behind. So getting a wagon stuck can take days to recover from, whether it's getting it out, fixing it, figuring out a solution. Native Americans and bandits would attack and steal from the wagon parties. Again, when you've got a limited amount of supplies that you and your family are living on, losing a couple pounds of food can be very devastating. Wagons would occasionally catch fire if a lantern breaks or a campfire and dry grass spreads to your wagon. A burning wagon, also a devastating thing to happen. Children occasionally would be, not occasionally, this was way more common than you'd think it was, but children would almost regularly be trampled by the ox or run over by the wagon and be crushed to death very quickly. Happens way more than you would expect something like that to happen, but when you're getting tired and not paying attention, stuff can come up from behind before you know it. Like we said, drowning was very common because these people didn't know how to swim, and if they got lost in the wilderness, you're on your own. Best of luck. However, as we were saying before, one of the worst things that could happen is not making it to Oregon for winter. If you get stuck on the trail out in the outdoors when winter hits, it was going to be a bad time. Winter made food scarcer, fires were harder to make, diseases spread way easier, and with the snow, it made wagon travel much slower, if not impossible. Does anyone know of any significant stories involving the Oregon Trail that might happen to do with someone who gets stuck during the winter time?
Perhaps.
Would you like to say it?
The Donner Party?
So, one of the greatest examples of how quickly and severely things can go wrong is the infamous Donner Party, whose poor decision-making, lack of preparation, and ultimately bad luck became one of the trail's most widespread horror stories. And this is a horror story. So, the Donner Party. This is the one tangent that I really wanted to dive into. So, the Donner Party was a wagon party of 87 members and 60 to 80 wagons. This was made up of family members with a lot of children. Almost half of them were children. A couple of employees, and eventually 2 Native American guides. They left Independence on May 12th. The reason, it's important to know when they left because that was one of the first decisions that they would make before leaving Independence. If you left in like March, you'd have plenty of time to get there before winter, but you're still very early spring, so animals might still be difficult to find. Those rivers are going to be way fuller and harder to cross. So maybe waiting a couple months could be a better bet. However, if you left in late May, June, you're going to have to really hustle to make it before middle of November, first snowfall, before it gets cold. So they left Independence on May 12th, a reasonably good date. About a month later, they received a letter from Lansford Hastings, claiming he found a 350-mile shortcut that he named the Hastings Cutoff, and was willing to meet anyone who was willing to try the shortcut out and guide them along it. They decided to separate from the 500-plus wagon train to take this shortcut, despite the warnings from almost everyone saying it was a bad idea. The people in the wagon train were saying that's not a good idea. The people in the fort they stopped at said that's not a good idea. A lot of times people try to be very motivational, saying don't follow the status quo, pave your own path. In this situation, don't do that. Follow the established path. When they made it to the meeting point, they made it late, so Lansford Hastings had already left with a different wagon party to guide them along the trail. So instead of waiting, they didn't have time to wait. They decided to try going across it on their own, being guided by notes that Lansford Hastings had left on trees for them. Eventually, they came across one that just said, "Wait here. The path I made is way harder than I thought it would be. I'm having a really hard time with the wagon party that I'm currently leading. So wait here. I will come back. We will find a different path." So they were essentially met with three options. They could wait, which they really didn't want to do. They could go back to the 500 plus wagon train, follow the established path. They would have lost some time, but they could probably still get on the tail end of the path. Or they could just kind of go for it. And what they decided was to just kind of go for it. So they essentially paved their own path based off of what they thought Lansford Hastings' initial path was. Turns out he was right, and that the terrain was way too difficult. So they had a really unpleasant time going through this shortcut that eventually culminated in the Great Salt Lake Desert. On September 26th, they had finished this shortcut and were about a month behind off of where they would have been if they had stuck to the original trail. And they were also 100 oxen down and a couple lives shorter than they were when they started this shortcut. So ultimately, this was a very bad idea. The picture on the top left is kind of an image of this shortcut. You can't see terribly well, but it's very loose rocks, steep angles, not ideal for wagon travel. And then on the right is the Great Salt Lake Desert. It's essentially a great big opening of a salt desert. So while they traveled this, the movement combined with the sunlight really turned the salt into this gross, almost muddy clay goop material that really slowed them down. This desert crossing was supposed to take 2 days. It took them 6. By the time they got back on the trail, they were basically out of food and not doing too well physically or mentally. And then down here on this bottom map, this orange line is the shortcut they took. They left from Fort Bridger and crossed through to the green line because they were heading to California, not Oregon. And the purple line is what they could have taken. So while they may have saved distance, they did not save time. But then, fortunately, they arrived in Oregon and no bad things happened. Just kidding. On October 20th, they approached the Fremont Pass over Truckee Lake. By this time, they basically had no more food, but they were almost there. And they still had about a couple weeks before the winter was supposed to come, but winter came about 2 weeks early. On November 4th, it began to snow and would continue to snow for 8 days. At this point, they realized that they were not going to be making any more progress, and this is where they were going to be spending the winter. So they basically constructed simple log cabins from their surroundings to house the 81 people who were left. Again, 41 of them were children. From the very beginning, they didn't have a lot of food. No one knew how to fish because, again, these were not people who were used to living out in the land. These were, for lack of a better word, city folk. The best they could do was reach in and hope to grab a fish. They had one successful hunting where someone accidentally shot a bear. So that was worth celebrating. But for the most part, they had to rely on turning their rugs and the roofs of their log cabin, which were made of oxide, into this boiled goopy jelly, which in all of the journals from these people were described as one of the worst things that they've ever had. It wasn't very nutritious, but it was something. They couldn't get the cattle they had left to eat that because they basically got buried in the snow. So like their remaining cattle began to die of starvation or cold, and would then be buried in snow. They weren't always dead before they got buried. Some of them were buried in the snow and would then asphyxiate like they would in a avalanche. And then they couldn't get to those bodies just because of how intense the snow was. At the peak, there was about, by I think February, it'll say on the next slide, they received 22 feet of snow. Lots of things began to happen. Wounds became infected. There were some murders. Death rate began to rise. Things were looking very desperate. So historians called this final attempt to get help the forlorn help. And that's when things began to get really bad. So on December 16th, a party of 17 men, women, and a couple children attempted to cross the path on snowshoes. By December 23rd, they began discussing cannibalism. They discussed a couple of ideas on how to choose who fed the others. Some ideas were to do a duel, and the loser is tonight's dinner. Some pitched a lottery system, but what they ultimately decided on was just to use whoever died first. They didn't have to wait long. Once the eating began, they were very civilized and orderly about it. They made sure that everyone was kept separate, so no one ended up eating someone they were related to. They were always eating strangers, not their family. Hypothermia and malnutrition began to claim more lives. Still wasn't enough food, so they began to discuss murder. The obvious target at the time was their two Native American guides who were still there. So when this murder plot was being formed, someone warned the two guides who left in the night. However, they also hadn't eaten in months, so they didn't make it very far. And so the rest of the party caught up with them, murdered them, and ate them. And again, as we said before, laws didn't really apply in this area, so no one was ever charged for that murder, even though no one tried to hide it. When they finally did make it through this mountain pass to the other side, they encountered a Native American camp where the inhabitants initially fled because they witnessed these emaciated ghouls essentially crawling out of the mountains. Makes sense why they were run away. Of the 17 who initially left, 7 of them survived the 33-day trek and were able to get help. James Reed, who had been separated very early on, he had made it to California and was able to raise $1,300, which today would amount to $42,000, to organize multiple rescue parties. The first one arrived February 14th, about 3 months after they initially got stranded. The second arrived March 1st, and the third arriving March 14th. When they made it to the camp, they witnessed a similarly terrible sight. They had also converted to cannibalism. I think it's the first group, a handful of them did not survive because they still had to travel through the snow, and they weren't in great shape for traveling. Some notable ones were William Hook, who once he made it to California, almost immediately broke into a food store and ate until he died because he was so malnourished. The issue with malnourishment and dehydration is if you take in what you need, your body is not used to that amount of calories or hydration and stuff, and so it doesn't know how to react, and so you die. So that's what happened to William Hook. Virginia Reed, after starving for 3 months, made it into town and was almost immediately proposed to. She was also 13. She rejected the proposal, and then Keseberg was nearly lynched by the rescuers who had come to save him because he confessed to James Reed to killing and eating his kids. And also, they quickly learned that once the snow had begun to melt and the cattle had become available, he still preferred the human flesh over the ox. So he was a really not great dude. He did end up going to court for those murders, but he was not charged. And he also had a court case for the libel about him killing and eating kids, which was true. But he didn't like that, so he technically won that court case and was awarded $1, but he still had to pay court fines. So no one really liked him for some really good reasons. So I guess we'll get back on the trail. I think the worst is behind us. Look at that. We've made it to Oregon, the Willamette Valley. Beautiful, beautiful Oregon. And we can live a great life. Claim some land, make a farm, give our families a better life, make all of that pain worthwhile. So that's the end of my program. Does anyone have any questions about anything we went over? Yeah.
I think you can drive up to the top of Scotts Bluff.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've been up there, so.
Yeah.
I've driven to the top of it.
There's
Very interesting.
yeah, everything along the trail is now a landmark.
Mhm.
They renamed the lake and the pass after the Donner Party. There's also now a statue there that is 22 feet tall to symbolize how much snow they had received. 22 feet is a lot, very tall. Yeah.
There's also a place there where you can see where they used to lower the wagons down by cable to a lower elevation when they couldn't travel any further.
Yeah, as they began to travel along the trail, they began to simplify it. People would find easier routes. They'd find shortcuts. They would constantly switch. They made those, almost elevator type things to prevent them from having to travel downhill.
Mm-hmm.
They were graphic. I know there's a handful of people who would like abandon. They'd like make a raft for their wagon to sail across the river, and then be like, I just made like $5 doing that, and then they would kind of just stick around and become a ferryman.
Yeah.
So they would, instead of actually going all the way to Oregon, they'd stay at the river, charge a couple dollars to ferry wagons across, and make their living in the middle of the trail. How about you, buddy?
I can only imagine being like your great grandpa. Like it's like show and tell at your school, and they're like, "Okay, Stephanie, who's your great grandpa?" And he's like, "Oh, mine is William Hook, the guy that ate his children."
Yeah,
Like-
I mean, a handful of them.
It's like being Jeffrey Dahmer's kid. Oh yeah, mine is my dad's the guy who went to jail because he ate people.
I didn't put an animation on the last thing, but of the 87 people who initially left as part of the Donna Reed party, 47 of them made it to Oregon, which is maybe more than you'd think based off of everything they went through, but also when you think about how that's half of the total group, and most of them were children, not a lot of people made it to Oregon.
There were some pretty good mountains just trying to get into Utah down into the Salt Lake Desert. There's some big mountains right there.
Yeah, it's
So it was a rough trip. Once you got past Scotts Bluff and you're still looking west, it's still flat. Watch out in another month what's going to happen.
yeah.
Nothing but mountains.
I mean, from coming around like Illinois, when you travel out somewhere and you're like, oh, it's a mountain, that's super cool. But when all you see is mountains for 3 to 4 months, it loses a lot of its majesty.
When I come back from the west, I get out there a couple times a year. I'm coming through Denver and I see the flatland in front of me. I get a tear in my eye. I'm so happy to see flatland. It's out of the mountains.
So, yeah. If you've got the organ fever now, there's a lot of solutions. The South Public Library has plenty of books about the Oregon Trail for both kids and adults. I read a lot of the children books about Oregon Trail. There's some really good ones out there. There's a lot of good ones out there. Even like the Wikipedia article for the Donna Reed Party is really, really engaging. If you're looking for like a little nonfiction spooky story, there's a lot of subplots and personal relationships that were all cataloged in journals. So there's a lot of really fun drama looking back at it now, just on the Wikipedia articles alone.